So I love this little story that Kathy read for us out of the Gospel of Luke. There is so much in just 7 little verses for us to sort of glean and to unpack and to really get some really great meaning and meat off of. So I want you to imagine walking with Jesus. You're part of his crew. And you're about to head up to Jerusalem. And so you've made your last pit stop in the city of Jericho. Jericho, which boasts being the longest populated, inhabited city in all of the world. Historical records say that Jericho was founded in 9000 BCE. It has been a metropolitan city for 11,000 years. Jericho, that city where Jesus' namesake, Joshua, went and conquered as part of the giving of God to the Israelites in the promised land of Canaan. Joshua, who went with the Israelites and marched around the city walls for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, they blew the horn, the shofar, and what happened? The walls came tumbling down. In present-day Jericho, on the very spot where they say that this blind beggar was sitting, there is now a falafel stand. And Rabbi Devorah tells me that it's a really good falafel stand, and she's been trying to use it to entice me to join Temple Emmanuel on their trip to Israel in 2020. But this is the last stop before Jerusalem. Maybe Jesus and the disciples are there so they can get a falafel and a soda. They'll then take the road up to Jerusalem. It is always the road up to Jerusalem, Jericho to Jerusalem, 15 miles, almost all the way uphill. If you go from Jerusalem to Jericho, you go down to Jericho, even though you're going north. If you're going from Jericho to Jerusalem, you actually go up to Jerusalem, even though you're going south. And here on the side of the road, as Jesus and his disciples parade into the city, is this man who is blind, who has vision impairment. And he is forced to be outside of the city because of his physical ailment. Due to Jewish law at the time, he is forced to leave the city because his ailment makes him ritualistically unclean. And until he gets his sight back and then presents himself to the authorities in Jerusalem at the temple, then he is unclean and does not seem to be fit to live in civilized society. So he has been forced to move outside of civilized society because of his physical ailment, which makes him spiritually unclean, which makes him, in the parlance of the 21st century, an undesirable and untouchable. And so Joshua came to Jericho to conquer the physical city by dismantling physical walls. But Jesus has come to Jericho to break down and dismantle those spiritual, emotional, economic, socio-political walls of hostility that blind us and divide us today. And if you don't think that there are walls of hostility that divide us today, then we are blind. And that hostility is real. It was real 2,000 years ago on the streets of Jericho, as it is real in the streets of San Diego here in the 21st century. And this blind man living on the streets is forced to beg for his subsistence because he is told to be quiet when he has the audacity to ask for mercy. This blind man shouts out from where he is sitting on the side of the road, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the crowd shushes him. The Greek word here for mercy is eleos. It can just as easily and rightfully be translated as kindness or goodwill. He could have said, "Jesus, Son of David, be kind to me." Or, "Jesus, Son of David, show me goodwill." "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the people around him shush him. The crowd cries out to silence him. But he will not be denied. So if you walk away from this sermon hearing nothing else, sisters and brothers, don't ever let the crowd shush you and deny you your dignity and your self-worth when you have the audacity to ask for a kindness or a mercy or goodwill? This man advocates for himself, despite all of the naysayers around him. He will not let society and culture tell him that he has no voice. He will not allow his plight to dictate his dignity and self-worth. Those are done on his own terms. And so with an even louder cry of determination, he cries out, and Jesus hears him. Here, the Son of God, God incarnate, doing that God thing that God always does. God hears the cries of the people. Jesus inclines the divine ear of God to hear the cry of this man who is suffering, who has been oppressed by his society, that is downtrodden because of his plight. And once Jesus hears this man's cries, he is moved to do something about it. So if you don't hear anything else out of this sermon, then hear this. When you hear the cry of someone who has the audacity to ask for a kindness, do what you can do. None of us are Jesus. Shocking, I know. So you are not expected to heal and to give back the sight to a blind man. But all of us have the capacity, when someone has the audacity to ask for a kindness, to do what we can do. And so Jesus is moved to do what he can do to alleviate this man's suffering. And once Jesus hears this man cry out, the very first thing he does is stand still. He literally stops in his tracks at the sound of suffering and this plea for mercy. He does not allow this opportunity to pass him by, to show grace and compassion. Jesus hears him, and he stops. Let me try to put this into context that we might understand here in Kensington. Imagine it's Memorial Day, and there's this wonderful parade going down Marlborough. And walking with the Kensington preschool is Jesus himself. And as they get to in front of the church, there is a man who hasn't bathed in 30 days, who's been living on the streets, scraggly with a long beard, and he smells and reeks. And he's sitting there, and out of his madness, he says, "Jesus, have mercy on me." And Jesus has the audacity to stop the parade, and everyone screeches to a halt and says, "Hey, man, we got to get to the Kin Cafe for our mimosas and quiche." But Jesus calls the man to join him in the parade and does what he can to alleviate his suffering. After half healing a blind man a couple of chapters before this, where it takes Jesus 2 times to heal the man, Jesus does a little bit of work to open the eyes of his disciples. In Caesarea Philippi, he tells them that the Son of Man must undergo a great suffering and be rejected by the religious authorities and be killed, but on the third day will rise again. Upon hearing this, Peter, the very first disciple, rebukes Jesus for this teaching because Peter cannot see. Then, passing through Galilee, Jesus tells the disciples again that the Son of Man will be betrayed and killed and will rise from the dead. And in a very odd response to this prophecy, the brothers James and John of Zebedee, the second and third disciple, ask if they can sit on Jesus' left and right side in glory. You can almost hear in that story Jesus sighing with exasperation at these two because John and James didn't see it. And yet, here again, right before we get to where Kathy read for us this morning, as they're taking the last pit stop into Jericho, before they go up to Jerusalem, where he will be betrayed, where he will suffer, where he will die, the Son of Man will be handed over, he says, and killed, and will rise again on the third day. But Luke tells us that they did not understand and were afraid to ask, because at this point, all of the disciples don't understand what he is talking about. But this man, this outsider, this ritualistically unclean person, sees perfectly who Jesus is. And Jesus recognizes the common humanity that he has with this man who is suffering and says to him, "Receive your sight, for your faith has saved you." I didn't hear anything from his faith. We don't know if this man believes in the virgin birth. This man has not received a resurrection appearance. I didn't hear him say a prayer, did you? He hasn't confessed that he's a sinner. He hasn't accepted Jesus into his heart. He hasn't gone to any church that I know of. He hasn't shared his thoughts on women being clergy, same-sex marriage, or any belief in the afterlife. He's been blind for so long that we know for a fact he hasn't read a word of the Bible. And yet, all he wants to do is see. And when he knows where to go to receive that gift. And so he has persevered so long, resting and relying only on God's daily bread and graces. And he isn't going to allow this opportunity to pass him by if we would only have such faith. And so maybe that's the definition of faith. Faith isn't an intellectual belief or holding on a series of propositions or doctrines. Faith is rather connected to the recognition of your most basic human need to be known by God, to rest in God, to rely on God, to be free from all that numbs us and blinds us, and to erect that and to get outside and to break down the walls that are built up that keep us from being fully human the way that God would want us to be, and recognizing the dignity and worth and blessedness of all of God's creation. Maybe that's what faith is, and maybe it's this faith that saved this man. And then this man immediately decides to follow Jesus. He went from having faith in Jesus to having the faith of Jesus, following him to Jerusalem, where Jesus predicted 3 different times that he would be betrayed, suffer, and die, but that there would be resurrection too. This blind man who couldn't physically see had the heart to see Jesus clearly for who he was, and then had the courage to see that our faith journey not only starts with faith in Jesus, but it must get on the road with Jesus and mature and grow and evolve into the faith of Jesus. Faith in Jesus, faith with Jesus, faith of Jesus. Seeing with the heart of Jesus must be an important part of our life in faith. We keep our eyes open because we see with the eyes of Christ. We keep our heart open because we see with the heart of Christ. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. First, this man acknowledges Jesus. Next, he is healed by Jesus. And then he decides to walk with Jesus. Before this man looked at anything again, Jesus became the context for everything he'll see. After his healing, he won't see anything without thinking of the one who saved him, Jesus. In other words, in this man's salvation, he'll never see the world the same way again. Before a single ray of light hits the first molecule of any retina, Jesus becomes the very context in which this man sees everything. A few weeks ago, I was on my way to Mission Hills, UCC, for a bureaucratic meeting. Lord have mercy. As I was coming off of this 163 on to Washington, I made it through the first stoplight, but I was stopped at the second stoplight right there at Washington and 4th or 5th. On my left-hand side is one of those buildings and a lot of concrete, but on my right-hand side is right before the hospital turnoff, there's an apartment complex or something, and there's a nice big grassy knoll in front of it. And right there, off to my right, out of my peripheral vision, I looked and I saw that on that grassy knoll was a blind man. How did I know that he was blind? Because on one hand, he had one of those long, thin sticks, and on the other hand, he had holding a harness, and on that harness was one of the most beautiful German shepherds I have ever seen. And that German shepherd was taking a dumpski from his rumpski. But the blind man was a good citizen. He had good civic responsibility about him. And so he decided that he was going to pick up that dumpski like a good person should. But he's blind. He doesn't know where the dumpski is. So what he does, in one of the most tender motions I have ever seen. Starting with the head of the German Shepherd, he pets him all the way down his back, down to the haunches, where the German Shepherd hasn't moved, and he is squatting over the dumpski. And he reaches down, and he picks it up. Sisters and brothers, it was the most beautiful poop I've ever seen. It was such an act of tenderness and love, kindness, and mercy. Here was a man with vision impairment who was showing me how to live a life of grace and compassion. Here was a man who had no vision, but who was seeing through the eyes of a companion who loved him unconditionally. And right as I started to get choked up at the beauty of this act of defecation, I heard behind me a man laying on his horn because the light had turned green and he had somewhere to be. The parade needed to move forward, and he wasn't happy that I had stood still to witness this beauty, this mercy, this kindness. Sister and brothers, there's brokenness and ugliness, hurt and suffering all around us. But there is resurrection too. If we will just stop, stand still, open our ears, we can hear the cries. If we'll just open our eyes, and we will see with the eyes of Christ, and we can do what we can do. We can work and we can live into resurrection, even in the midst of Lent. That dog did what it could do. Christ did what he could do. On our walk with him, he is asking us to do what we can do. And when we are working together with the eyes and hearts, the hands and feet of Christ, I promise you, in the spirit of resurrection, it'll be one of the most beautiful things you've ever seen. Amen and amen.